In the winter of 1839, somewhere along the low marshlands of coastal Georgia, an entire hour went missing. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. An actual hour, measured, logged, and witnessed, disappeared from the written record. At precisely 2 a.m., the plantation bell rang at Hollow Creek Estate, as it had every night for 30 years. Overseers later testified that they heard it. Dogs stirred. Lanterns were lit. The routine of control continued as always. But by 3 a.m., something impossible had occurred. 250 enslaved men, women, and children, entire bloodlines, entire generations, were gone. No struggle, no fire, no blood in the dirt. Chains lay open. Cabins stood empty. Half-eaten food cooled on wooden tables. Infants' blankets were folded neatly at the foot of beds. And not a single footprint led away from the plantation. What makes this event unbearable is not only what vanished, but what was later discovered. Because within weeks, travelers began whispering of a town that did not exist on any map. A settlement built in silence. A place where the bells rang without churches and the dead were said to walk freely beside the living. This is not a story of escape. This is a story of disappearance. And the deeper we descend into it, the more we realize. Someone wanted them erased. Hollow Creek Estate was not known for cruelty. That is what the records say. Owned by the Caldwell family since 1798, the plantation appeared unremarkable. No notorious punishments, no documented uprisings, no public scandals. Ministers visited monthly. Baptisms were recorded. The plantation church stood at the center of the land like a watchful eye. But silence, in history, is rarely innocence. The enslaved population of Hollow Creek was unusually large for its acreage. Entire families lived there, grandparents, cousins, newborns. Records show births carefully logged, deaths quietly minimized. Children were not sold off as often as on neighboring estates. Instead, they were kept, preserved. The plantation chapel was said to be progressive. Services were mandatory. Attendance was enforced. Sermons emphasized obedience not just to God, but to order, time, and place. Former overseers described a strange custom. Every Sunday night, after the white congregation left, the enslaved were required to remain. Doors were closed. Candles were extinguished. And what happened next was never written down. Older slaves were said to hum, not songs, but tones. Long, sustained notes that made listeners feel dizzy. Children were told never to speak of those nights. One woman, later interviewed decades after emancipation, said only this: "They taught us how to leave without running." No one asked what she meant. The night Hollow Creek emptied, nothing seemed unusual until it was. The head overseer, Thomas Reed, reported that at 2:40 a.m., the plantation dogs stopped barking all at once. Not howling, not panicked, silent. Lantern light revealed gates still locked. Chains unbroken. The river calm. Cabins were inspected first. They were clean. Too clean. Beds were made. Shoes were aligned. Personal items, letters, small carved figures, prayer tokens, had been gathered into small piles, as if left behind deliberately. Not abandoned. Returned. In the chapel, Reed found something that never appeared in official reports. The bell rope had been cut. Not torn. Not frayed. Cut cleanly, like a ritual severing. Under the pulpit, carved into the floorboards, was a symbol no one recognized. A circle broken by 4 inward lines, each pointing toward an empty center. By sunrise, armed patrols searched miles of swamp and forest. They found no tracks. By noon, slave catchers were sent to neighboring counties. They found nothing. By nightfall, panic spread, not fear of revolt, but fear of vanishing. Because people do not disappear in groups without leaving the world behind, unless they were taught how. 3 months later, a traveling preacher recorded an entry in his journal while lost off the main road. "I came upon a settlement that should not be there." He described cabins arranged in a circle, gardens already grown, children playing without supervision, bells ringing without a visible church. He claimed the people spoke softly, as if sound itself was sacred. When he asked where they came from, an elder answered, "We arrived when the hour opened." The preacher left before nightfall. Others were not so fortunate. Over the next decade, rumors accumulated. Surveyors who vanished, hunters who returned changed, missionaries who refused to speak of what they saw. Maps showed empty land where witnesses insisted a town stood. Local officials dismissed the stories. Then they buried the files. County ledgers from 1840 to 1865 contain missing pages. Church registries skip entire years. Birth records end abruptly. And Hollow Creek Plantation? Burned to the ground in 1861 by unknown hands. No investigation followed. Today, descendants still live near that land. Some say, on certain nights, when the air is heavy and the marsh is quiet, bells can still be heard, ringing not to gather people, but to mark an hour that no longer exists. What Hollow Creek taught was not escape. It was timing. Fragments of testimony, collected decades later from freed men and women who refused to give names, describe something called the doctrine of the hour. It was never written, never preached openly, and never spoken of outside the plantation chapel. According to these fragments, time itself was considered a form of captivity. Not clocks, not calendars, but the agreement, the shared belief that moments must follow one another in an unbroken line. The enslaved at Hollow Creek were taught that if enough people withdrew their consent from an hour, if they refused to inhabit it, that hour could collapse. Children were instructed differently than adults. They were told stories. Stories of an older time, before plantations, before churches, before bells, when villages moved together, vanished together, survived by becoming unlocatable. The elders taught that memory was a map, and if you burned the map, the hunter would walk in circles forever. Sunday night gatherings were not worship. They were rehearsals. Participants stood in complete darkness. Breathing synchronized. Humming began low, almost beneath hearing. Each person focused not on leaving, but on staying nowhere. Those who could not endure the dizziness were taken outside. Those who remained learned how to loosen themselves from the hour. This was not rebellion. This was disappearance as discipline. Plantation records show something strange long before the vanishing. Children at Hollow Creek stopped crying at night. Not gradually. All at once. Midwives reported infants who stared instead of wailing. Overseers complained that children watched too much. A visiting physician wrote that the young showed an unnatural calm, inappropriate for their condition. One surviving testimony, given in 1912, describes a lesson taught only to children. They said grown people had already been nailed to the hour. But children were still loose. The children learned to imagine spaces without edges. They practiced standing perfectly still until the world felt thin. They were taught to follow bells only when the bells rang wrong. On the night of disappearance, witnesses later admitted something terrifying. The children woke the adults, not the other way around. They moved from cabin to cabin without panic. No shouting, no confusion. Families did not scatter, they assembled. And when the plantation bell rang at 2 a.m., the children covered their ears. Because they had been warned. Slave catchers were experienced men. They knew swamps. They knew silence. They knew fear. What they did not know was how to pursue people who were no longer moving forward. Search dogs refused to track. Horses bucked at invisible boundaries. Compasses spun uselessly near Hollow Creek's borders for weeks afterward. One hunter reportedly said, "It felt like chasing yesterday." Those who claimed to see the town described it differently each time. Sometimes closer, sometimes impossibly far. Roads bent. Distances misbehaved. The town appeared only when travelers stopped looking for it. And no one ever found it at night. Former enslavers began to fear something worse than revolt. They feared contagion. Because if disappearance could be taught, it could spread. That is when the churches intervened. In 1841, a closed-door meeting occurred between plantation owners, clergy, and county officials. No minutes survive. But afterward, something unmistakable happened. The language changed. Where records once listed missing persons, they began to list unaccounted labor. Where sermons once emphasized obedience, they shifted to presence, the holiness of staying, of remaining visible, of existing where you are placed. Maps were redrawn. The town was labeled swamp. Witnesses were dismissed as drunk, delusional, or sinful. And Hollow Creek became a warning spoken only in private. Do not let them gather. Because what vanished from that plantation was not just 250 lives. It was proof that the system depended on time being uninterrupted. And somewhere, off the map, off the clock, a town continued to exist by refusing to be found. Those who claimed to enter the town all reported the same warning, spoken softly, never repeated. Do not count. Inside the settlement, there were no dates, no ages, no anniversaries. Children were not told how old they were. Elders were not called old. Counting, they believed, invited capture. Homes were built in circles, not rows. Paths curved gently, denying straight lines their authority. Nothing pointed outward. Nothing marked direction. The bell. Yes, there was a bell. Rang not to summon, but to release. Each toll marked the end of an unsafe moment. When it rang, everyone paused, breathed, and waited until the air felt thick again. Outsiders noticed something else. No one hurried. Time, unmeasured, stretched. Days felt longer but lighter, like standing underwater without needing to surface. Hunger existed, but panic did not. Work was done, but never scheduled. The most unsettling rule was this: no one leaves alone. Leaving alone meant re-entering the hour, and those who did not return as themselves. In 1847, a surveyor named Eli Mercer crossed into the town accidentally while mapping disputed land. His journal survived. At first, he wrote with wonder. They do not look hunted. By the third day, his handwriting changed. He wrote of losing track of his heartbeat, of forgetting which memories belonged to him, of children who looked at him with sorrow, not fear. On the fifth day, he tried to leave. Witnesses inside the town later said he insisted on knowing the date. He demanded coordinates. He began counting his steps. The bell rang once, and Mercer collapsed. When he awoke, he was outside the settlement, alone, days or years later. He returned home, speaking of gaps in his life. He aged rapidly. He died within a year, whispering, "They gave it back to me too fast." After that, the town sealed itself further. Back at Hollow Creek, long after the burning, excavations uncovered something impossible. Beneath the chapel floor were rows of small carvings, each one representing a person who vanished. Not graves, markers. Each figure had no face, because names, they believed, anchored you. No bones were ever found. What was found instead were journals written by ministers who had sensed something wrong. One entry ended abruptly. If they have found a way to step outside the hour, then slavery is not the crime we must fear most. The page was torn after that sentence. The town did not live forever untouched. Children born there eventually asked questions. Some wanted to know the world they were hidden from. Curiosity, like time, has gravity. Those who chose to leave were prepared carefully. They were taught how to re-enter, slowly, painfully. They returned changed, aging unevenly, remembering too much, forgetting names of people they loved. But they carried one warning back with them. Freedom without time is peace. Freedom with time is a wound. By the early 1900s, sightings of the town stopped. Either it moved again, or it finished what it began. By the late 1800s, the Hollow Creek incident had transformed from a buried scandal into a whispered obsession among certain religious institutions. They called it temporal heresy. Clergy who studied the fragments believed the enslaved had not escaped God, but discovered a loophole he never intended humans to touch. If time could be loosened, then obedience, hierarchy, and divine order were at risk. So they tried to reclaim it. Church-run orphanages in Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama began experimental prayer sessions. Children were chosen because of their impressionability. Lights were dimmed, silence enforced, bells rung irregularly. But these sessions were missing something essential: consent. The children screamed. They did not thin. They fractured. Some became catatonic. Others developed night terrors where hours repeated endlessly. One orphanage burned after children claimed the walls were closing late. The doctrine failed because it was never meant to dominate. It was meant to withdraw. In 1931, a woman named Lillian Graves gave an interview to a folklorist. She claimed her grandmother had been among the vanished. Lillian said her grandmother returned once. Just once. She appeared at the edge of the family land, aged and unaged at the same time. She did not step fully into the yard. She stood where the grass grew uneven. Her warning was simple: do not try to find us. We are held together by not being seen. When Lillian asked where the town was, her grandmother smiled sadly. If I tell you, it will collapse. She left behind a wooden carving with no face. In 1949, a graduate student at Emory University claimed to have reconstructed the town's location using erased land records. His map changed every time he looked away. Coordinates drifted. ink smudged without touch. He became obsessed, counting hours, tracking moon cycles, marking bells he swore he heard at night. His thesis was rejected. 2 weeks later, he disappeared while driving through the marsh. His car was found running. Clock stopped at 2:40 a.m. History depends on sequence. Slavery depended on it too. If one group proved they could step outside the sequence, leave without revolt, vanish without blood, then the entire structure collapsed. So the story was sealed, not erased, contained, because containment is safer than denial. But stories like this do not die. They wait. Modern historians will tell you nothing like this ever happened. They will say records were lost to war, fire, negligence. They will explain away the gaps with language that feels complete. But certain hours still misbehave. In rural Georgia, people report moments when clocks disagree. Church bells ring once and stop. Phones lose signal at the same bend in the road every time. And always, always, at 2:40 a.m. Not every night, just enough to be noticed. Those who wake during that hour describe the same sensation. The feeling that something has paused, waiting to see who notices. The town does not appear on maps, but its influence does. In communities founded by formerly enslaved families, there are traditions no one can explain. Meals eaten without watching the clock, children taught never to count steps at night, elders who refuse to celebrate birthdays. Not superstition, inheritance, a way of keeping the hour closed. Wooden carvings without faces still surface in antique shops. Their origins untraceable. Their purpose misunderstood. They are not memorials. They are anchors, holding people in the present so they are not pulled back. Some believe the town dissolved long ago, its purpose fulfilled. Others believe it still exists, moving carefully, quietly, teaching new generations how to loosen their grip on time just enough to survive. And a few, very few, believe the town waits for another hour of mass cruelty. Because it was never about escape. It was about refusal. Refusal to be counted. Refusal to be scheduled. Refusal to exist only where power demands. When the bell rings wrong, the lesson remains. You do not have to go where the hour tells you. You may feel unsettled now, not afraid, just aware. Of moments that stretch. Of silences that feel intentional. Of hours that seem thinner than others. That is not imagination. It is memory. Because the system that buried this story still depends on time being uninterrupted. On people believing every hour belongs to someone else. But once, just once, 250 people proved that an hour could be emptied. And somewhere, beyond the map and beneath the bell, it still can be.